There is a photograph everyone in the world has seen, or thinks they have seen. A young man in a silver spacesuit, his head tilted, his smile half shy and half enormous, framed by a school wall and a poster that has outlived 3 generations. It was printed on stamps, on postcards, on the walls of classrooms from Vladivostok to Havana. It hung above blackboards in countries he never visited. The man in the photograph became the first human being to leave the planet, and then became a kind of weather, something the whole world agreed on, the way one agrees on gravity or the color of the sky. If you look carefully at the famous image, you will notice, almost out of frame, on the left, the blurred shape of a woman. Dark coat, hands folded in front of her, head half turned away. She is not smiling for the camera, she is not posing. She is simply there, in the role she would play for the rest of her life, present at the edge of someone else's legend. That woman was Valentina Ivanovna Gagarina, born Goryacheva. She would outlive her husband by more than 50 years. She would almost never speak about what she knew, and when, at the very end, she finally opened a door that had been locked for half a century, it was not a confession of sensation. There was no secret tape, no hidden diary in a safe in Switzerland, no deathbed revelation in the style of supermarket journalism. There was simply a woman who had been widowed at 34, who had been made part of an official myth she never asked for, and who had chosen, deliberately and at great cost, the discipline of silence. What she revealed in the end was not a bombshell. It was the truth of how it felt to live beside the world's first space myth, and to learn, year after year, that being the wife of a saint and being a person are not the same thing. She died in the spring of 2017 in a Moscow apartment, in her sleep, with no struggle. By her own bed, as if it had been planned, was her younger daughter Galya. There had been no reason for Galya to stay the night. No illness, no appointment in the morning, nothing that required her presence. She had simply wanted to be near her mother, the way people sometimes do in the last days of someone they love, without being able to explain why. In the morning, she entered the room. Her mother lay calmly, hands folded over the blanket, the way Galya remembered from her own childhood, when her mother thought of something far away and let her face go quiet. There was no pain on that face. There was no fear. Only a kind of listening, as if Valentina Ivanovna had heard something none of the rest of them could hear, and had decided, finally, to follow it. The news did not come the way news had come in her husband's time. In 1968, it came through the crackle of a radio and the carefully measured voice of a state announcer. In 2017, it came through phones and screens, through thousands of small messages sent briefly and precisely, the way people write when they know the words will not be enough. Valentina Gagarina is gone. People who had never met her typed her name as if they had. People who had been children when she was already an old woman remembered her face from grainy television. People who had no idea what Star City was, or what it meant to live inside a myth, wrote simply, "Thank you." The next morning, on the wall of the building where she had spent her last years, a small wooden plaque appeared. It was homemade. The letters were burned into the wood by hand, the way rural craftsmen used to mark the beams of a house, or the way prisoners used to mark a calendar on a wall. No one knew who had made it. No one ever found out. The authorities did not remove it. Perhaps they understood, for once, that removing one piece of burned wood from one wall of one building would not change anything. Perhaps they felt, as institutions sometimes do, the faint, humiliating nudge of shame. In either case, the plaque stayed. It is still there, in the memory of those who saw it, a small, stubborn fact that refused to be tidied away. This is the story of the woman in the dark coat at the edge of the famous photograph. It is not the story of the man in the silver suit. He has had his statues, his streets, his planet named after him, his portrait in every school book. This is the other side of the legend, the side that never had its own poster. It is the story of a girl from Orenburg who grew up between the steppe and a river, who trained to bear other people's pain and then was asked to bear her own, and who understood early that in the country she lived in, being seen and being safe were opposites. It is the story of a wife and mother who was made, against her will, into a frame for someone else's glory, and who learned, with terrible precision, how to choose her words inside her own kitchen. It is the story of a silence that lasted half a century, and of what that silence actually cost. We are used in the 21st century to a particular kind of story about famous widows. They write memoirs, they give interviews, They appear on television, often with a soft light behind them, and they tell us, in a measured voice, what it was really like. Sometimes they sue for the rights to a story. Sometimes they sell them. The story of Valentina Ivanovna Gagarina is not that kind of story. She refused memoirs. She refused the most lucrative offers from publishers and television channels. She refused not because she had nothing to say, but because she understood, from long experience, that to say things is to make them real, and to make them real is to enter a fight in which the other side has had 50 years to prepare. And yet she did speak. In the last decade of her life, after decades of refusal, she spoke carefully to people she had chosen, in rooms without microphones, in conversations that were recorded only when she allowed them to be. She did not reveal a hidden diary full of state secrets. She revealed something more difficult to receive. She revealed the texture of a life lived under a particular kind of pressure, the texture of a grief that has been turned into an exhibit, and the texture of a choice to be silent year after year in order to protect two small girls who had to grow up without their father and without a public opinion of their mother. The most important thing to understand about Valentina Gagarina is that her silence was not absence, it was work. It took decades. It required patience, intelligence, and a kind of moral courage that does not look like courage at all from the outside. To those who watched, she was simply the widow of a great man, dignified and quiet, a suitable figure for the anniversary postcards. To those who knew her, she was something else entirely, a woman who knew more than she was allowed to say, who remembered more than she was allowed to write, and who chose, every single day for more than half a century, to put her daughter's safety above her own need to speak. We will return, in later parts of this story, to the small device she once found at the base of a chandelier, and to the warning a man in a fire inspector's uniform gave her at her own door. We will sit at her kitchen table at 3 a.m. and listen to a man who knew he was not long for the world. We will follow the folder that was taken from her husband's desk and never returned, and the pencil line on a piece of paper that ended in an ashtray. We will wait, as she waited, for 50 years. But before any of that, it is worth pausing on the image with which we began, a woman almost out of frame, on the edge of a photograph that defined a century. The frame is important. The world put her husband in the center of the frame and made him into a sun. She stood at the edge, like a planet, like a piece of furniture, like an accessory to greatness. But planets have their own gravity, even when they are not painted on the walls of schools. And furniture, in the right light, can outlive the rooms it once furnished. The photograph on the wall is famous. The plaque on the wall of the building where she died is not famous, and probably never will be. But it is the truer document of the two. It was not commissioned, it was not approved, it was not placed there by a ministry or a committee. It was placed there by someone who wanted to mark, with the simplest tools available, the fact that a particular woman had lived in that building, and that her absence mattered. She was Valentina Ivanovna Gagarina, née Goryacheva, daughter of Orenburg, wife of a cosmonaut, mother of 2 daughters who are still alive, widow for 52 years of a man who flew once around the earth and never flew again. She did not need to reveal anything before she died to be worthy of attention. She needed only to have lived, and to have chosen, day after day, how to live within a story that was never entirely hers. The plaque is still there. No one removed it. The wood is beginning to weather. The letters, burned by hand, are still legible. In a country that has spent 100 years learning to remove things from walls, this is, in its small way, a kind of miracle. Valentina Ivanovna Gagarina, before she was the widow of the first man in space, was a girl from a city that most of the world has never heard of. She was born in 1935 in Orenburg, a place where the Russian steppe meets a wide, slow river, and where, in the winters she grew up in, the wind could come off the flatlands for days at a time without ever letting up. Her father was a worker, the kind of Soviet working man whose pay stub would be the same as 10,000 others, and whose name would never appear in any newspaper. Her mother was a housewife, with the calloused hands and tired eyes that housewives in that country, and at that time, tended to have, because the labor they did was real, even if the state did not classify it as labor. The family was ordinary in the way Soviet families were ordinary. They had enough, if you didn't compare. They had warmth in winter, food most days, the sense that life was difficult but not unusual. They did not stand out, and they did not want to. In 1948, when Valentina was 13, her father lost his job. This was not uncommon in those years, after the war, in a country that was rebuilding itself in directions that did not always pass through the provinces. The family moved first to a small town near Orenburg, where there was rumored to be work, and then further out to a place where there was in fact work but few people. Valentina became, overnight, the kind of child who learns very young that stability is a privilege. She was the middle child of three, neither the eldest who carries everything, nor the youngest who is indulged. The middle child, as she would later put it in a rare conversation, is invisible in the right sense of the word. She learns to listen before she speaks. She learns that her share of attention will be smaller, and she does not learn to resent it. Her teachers did not remember her as brilliant. They remembered her as reliable. A class teacher would say of her, years later, when journalists began to come around, that Goryacheva would always do what she was asked to do. It is a small compliment. It is also, in retrospect, the most accurate description of the woman she became. She was not the smartest girl in her class. She was the one who, when a teacher asked for something difficult, would simply do it, without fuss, without complaining, without wondering whether anyone would notice that she had done it. It was a quiet kind of strength, the kind that does not photograph well. After school, she went to a medical college in Orenburg, a modest provincial institution whose name does not appear in any history book. She did not go because she dreamed of becoming a doctor. She went because it offered a profession, and a profession in the Soviet Union of the late 1940s and early 1950s was a kind of independence. She studied diligently. She took night shifts in a hospital where she learned not to flinch at the sight of strangers' pain, where she learned the smell of disinfectants and the sound of breathing that should not be the way it was. In the corridors of that hospital, she first heard the word aviation spoken with a particular heat by young men who passed through on their way to something else. It sounded to her, she would later say, like another world, a world she had no claim on, a world of noise, of speed, of men. In the late 1950s, in Orenburg, there was a higher aviation school for pilots. It was a place that produced young men with burning eyes, young men who had read the right books at the right age and had concluded that the sky was not a metaphor, but a place. Among them was a cadet named Yura Gagarin. He was not tall, this was noted by everyone who ever described him, as if his height were a feature of his legend. But when he spoke, or when he looked at whatever he was thinking about, he had a way of filling the space around him. He had a quiet laugh and a real gaze, the kind of gaze that does not pretend to see more than it sees. Valentina met him the way people in that country met then, through a shared company, through students and cadets who went together to dances at the factory club on Fridays. It was an ordinary Soviet Friday. There was a bayan in the corner of the hall. The parquet was dusty. The cologne the young men wore was cheap and applied with more hope than skill. Valentina was there with friends. Yuri was there with friends. He came over, as the custom of the time allowed, and invited her to a waltz. He asked her, awkwardly, almost officially, as if he were taking an exam. She accepted, also somewhat officially, because that was the form the evening required. They moved onto the floor. The bayan played something that was meant to sound Viennese, but sounded more like a provincial accordion's idea of Vienna. And in the middle of the dance, with the same awkward, almost official tone, Yuri said to her, "You know the waltz was invented so people wouldn't be silent. That means we must speak, we must not be afraid." She did not understand then that it was not about the dance. It was not even, in the end, about speaking. It was about a quality he possessed, the quality of saying ordinary things in a way that made them sound like they mattered, and of meaning, underneath the ordinary words, something he was not yet ready to say aloud. She remembered the line for the rest of her life, and in the years after his death she would return to it, in her mind, as one returns to a small object kept in a drawer. They dated for 9 months. By the standards of that time, in that place, this was long. By their characters, it was enough. They were not the kind of couple that burned itself out. They were the kind that grew steadier, week by week, until they understood that what they had was not infatuation, but something that could bear weight. Yuri was a man of his word. He did not bring flowers as often as other young men did. But once, he brought her a small bunch of wild chamomile he had picked outside the city, because she had once said, in passing, in a sentence she did not think anyone would remember, that she loved them. She did not remember, later, the flowers themselves. She remembered that he had heard her. They were married in 1957. The wedding was modest and warm, a small table in a small room crowded with more people than the room could comfortably hold. Valentina's dress was remade from fabric bought at the market. The cake was baked by her mother, in the provincial kitchen where cakes were always baked, with eggs that were hard to come by and patience that was not. Yuri looked at her all evening as if he had just found something he had been looking for a long time and had almost given up on. He was not eloquent. He did not need to be. He looked at her, and that was enough. They were given a room in a communal apartment, 18 square meters, neighbors behind the wall, a shared kitchen down the corridor. It was not romantic. It was not what the post-war Soviet dream promised in its brochures. But it was theirs, and they were happy in it, with the dense, small happiness of two people who have learned that happiness is not a large thing, but a series of small arrangements kept carefully in place. Valentina went to work as a feldsher, the kind of paramedic who is the first person a sick person sees in a small provincial hospital. Yuri continued studying and flying. In the evenings, in their 18 square meters, they sat at one table. He had his notes and charts. She had a textbook, or knitting, or simply her own thoughts. They did not talk much, not because they had nothing to say, but because they had reached the kind of silence that two people reach when they no longer need to prove anything to each other. It was a good silence. It would not last. In 1958, their first daughter was born. Her name was Yelena, Lena for short. She was small and dark-haired, with her father's eyes. Yuri held her carefully, with the exaggerated care of a man who is more used to handling mechanical things than newborns, as if she were made of something that must not be dropped or broken. He looked at his wife and said, "I'm a pilot, but this is scarier than being at 10 kilometers altitude." Valentina laughed. It was a good laugh, the kind of laugh that fills a small room and makes the neighbors behind the wall smile without knowing why. And then came the papers, autumn of 1959. Yuri began to stay late at the base. He went on trips he could not explain. He came home with the particular weariness of a man who is keeping something from the people he loves. One evening he sat at the kitchen table, took a pen, stared at one point on the wall. Valentina put a cup of tea in front of him. She did not ask. "I'm being selected for a special project," he said. "Which one?" she asked. He raised his eyes, and in them she saw a new mixture she had not seen before, something between excitement and something darker, something she would come to recognize in the years ahead as the look of a man who understands that the path he is being offered has a cost that no one will name in advance. "Can't say yet," he said, "but if they take me, it will change everything. Us too, the country, the world, us too." He repeated the last two words, as if to make sure she heard them. Us too. He was already preparing her for a transformation that would not be hers to choose. Valentina did not interrogate him. He did not explain. It was part of their unspoken agreement, an agreement that had been building since the waltz and would define the rest of her life. They would not force each other into corners where neither of them wanted to stand. Several months later, late at night, he sat on the edge of the bed. She was already half asleep. He said, "I've signed." "Signed what?" she asked. "Everything," he said. She did not cry. She asked, "Is it dangerous?" He paused for longer than he should have, and then he said, "Everything worth doing is dangerous." They lay in the dark, each with their own fear, not speaking. Outside, snow was falling on Orenburg. Lena was asleep in the next room, breathing the way small children breathe, evenly, without knowing anything about the world her parents were now entering. Before closing his eyes, Yuri said, almost to himself, "You will be proud of me, but it will not be easy." Valentina did not answer. She already knew he was speaking the truth. She did not yet know how much of it. April 12, 1961 began the way the previous months had begun, with a feeling Valentina could not name, a kind of low hum at the back of her mind, the sense that something was being deliberately kept from her. She did not know yet that the thing being kept from her would, within hours, become the property of the entire planet. Yuri had left the evening before. He had said the word exercises, the way he had said other words in recent months, in a tone that did not quite fit the word itself. He had kissed Lena, who was 3, and already asking questions that no one in the family could fully answer. He had looked for a long time at little Galia, who was less than a month old and slept in her crib with her fists clenched, the way newborns do when they have not yet learned that the world is not something to fight. He had lingered at the crib longer than usual. Valentina stood in the doorway watching him. She could not tell whether he knew she was watching. Perhaps he knew and still stood. Perhaps he needed her to be watching, the way a person needs a witness at the moment of crossing a threshold he cannot name. Then he turned and smiled. It was the famous smile, the one that would soon belong to the world, but Valentina saw all its shades. They had been married for 4 years. She knew the smile he gave to officials, the smile he gave to colleagues, the smile he gave to their daughters. That evening it was none of those. He said, "Yura." He said, "Everything's fine." He said it too quickly. He took his suitcase and went out. The door closed softly behind him, as it always did, the way he had trained himself to close doors so as not to wake the children. Valentina went to the window and watched him cross the yard. He did not look back. It was not rudeness, it was discipline. Pilots are taught that doubt at the moment of takeoff kills. So you do not look back. You walk. You go. She did not sleep that night. It was not fear, because she did not yet know what there was to fear. It was the body refusing to settle, the mind listening to a silence that had a wrong shape to it. She listened to Galia breathing. She listened to the radiator creaking. She listened to a car in the distance and to the snow falling on Orenburg and to the small sounds a provincial apartment makes at night when there is no one to share them with. In the morning she fed Galia, took Lena to a neighbor, turned on the radio for background noise. She made porridge. She heated water. The announcer's voice had not yet changed. She did not know that it was about to change, that the special solemnity Soviet radio reserved for 2 kinds of news only, the death of someone very important or something breathtaking, was about to be deployed in her own kitchen. Moscow speaking. All radio stations of the Soviet Union are operating. She froze at the stove with a saucepan in her hand. Then came the words. On April 12, 1961, the world's first spaceship satellite Vostok has been launched into orbit around the Earth with a man on board. The pilot cosmonaut is citizen of the USSR, pilot Major Yuri Alexeyevich Gagarin. The saucepan fell. She did not remember how she sat down. She did not remember how long she sat. She remembered only that the radio went on, speaking triumphantly, and that she heard none of the words, only his voice from the night before. Everything's fine. Too fast, too carefully smiled. Exercises. There had been no exercises. Her husband was in space alone, in an iron capsule the size of a small room, at an altitude she could not imagine, and she had learned of it from the radio, the way everyone in the country had learned of it, as if she were not his wife, but a stranger to whom information is delivered in batches. About 40 minutes later, 2 men arrived. One was an officer in uniform. The other was a man in a civilian gray jacket, smiling as if smiling were part of his job description, which, in a sense, it was. They were polite. They were practiced. They sat in her kitchen and explained, with great care, that her husband was making a historic flight, that the country was proud of him, and that she, by extension, was part of that pride. "My role," she repeated, and the man in the gray jacket nodded. "You are the wife of the first cosmonaut on the planet. That carries certain obligations." The word obligations was spoken softly, almost tenderly, the way one speaks to people who are being told something unpleasant without naming it as unpleasant. They sat in her kitchen for almost 2 hours. They drank tea she poured automatically, the way her hands had learned to do in her years as a feldsher, even when her mind had left the room. They talked about the meeting that would come, the ceremony, what to wear, what to say to journalists, how to hold the children so their faces were visible but they did not fuss. At some point, the radio announced that the ship had landed safely, that the cosmonaut was alive. She exhaled for the first time in hours. Only then did she understand that she had been afraid, quietly, deeply, the way people who are not accustomed to showing fear are afraid, in the places of the body that cannot be photographed. The meeting was days later, and even with the special preparation, it was impossible to prepare for. Valentina was dressed, but not in clothes she had chosen. Her hair was done, but not by her own hands. She was told where to stand, where to look, when to smile. The briefing lasted half an hour. The instructions were precise. If journalists ask about the personal, answer briefly and warmly. They gave her the line to use. I believed in him. I knew he would come back. Nothing extra, nothing about the night before, nothing about the radio. She asked, what if I didn't know? There was a short pause. Then the briefer answered, now you do. Yuri flew to Moscow. The streets were packed so tight with people that the city seemed to breathe with one set of lungs. Flags, flowers, tears, shouts. She stood in her designated place and watched him in an open car. He was small, smiling, with an untied bootlace, which later became its own small legend. He saw her. He waved. He smiled, and this time the smile was real, alive, his. She waved back, the way she had been instructed to wave back. From a distance, no one could tell the difference. From close up, only she could. Late that night, after banquets and speeches and handshakes and photographs, he sat on the bed and was silent a long time. Valentina saw what no report captured, a fatigue so deep it does not pass in one night, maybe not in several years. Yura, she said, how was it? He raised his eyes. It was scary, Valya. 3 words. They never returned to it. From that night on, a certain territory inside their marriage was sealed, and both of them understood that it would remain sealed. The next week, the man in the gray jacket returned, this time with a paper. The language of the paper was dense and slippery, the kind of language that pretends to say one thing while meaning another. She was required not to disclose information about her husband's professional activity, not to discuss with outsiders the details of his work or preparation or well-being, not to give interviews without approval, not to correspond on relevant topics. She asked, what if I don't sign? The man answered, gently, Valentina Ivanovna, this is a formality, just a paper. Then why? Procedure. We do everything by procedure. She signed, not because she agreed, because she understood that they were not offering her a choice. They were offering to formalize the absence of choice as a voluntary decision. The pen was government issue and cold. Her signature came out even. Life changed sharply, as if someone had changed the scenery while she slept. The apartment became different, a new, large, good building. Yuri received a rank and awards and invitations. His face appeared on every kiosk, every postcard, every wall of every city. He became a shop window. Shop windows are smiled at, looked at. Shop windows are not asked what happens behind the glass. Valentina became what stands beside the shop window, the frame, the background, the part of the interior that must harmonize with the main exhibit but never distract. At official events, she smiled. In photographs, she smiled. When asked how it felt to be the wife of the first cosmonaut, she answered with a learned warmth, it is an honor and a happiness. The man in the gray jacket stood nearby and always listened. Sometimes the man changed. The jacket remained gray. At home, with the doors closed, she and Yuri talked less, not because they had cooled, because words had become dangerous. Every phrase carried a weight it had not before. Every conversation could become a report in someone else's hands. Yuri left more and more. Tours, meetings, visits, flights. He was everywhere and nowhere. The country loved him recklessly, devotedly, almost religiously. She waited for him to come home and say something real. Once he came back late and sat at the kitchen table staring at a cup of cold tea. Valya, you understand that we no longer belong to ourselves. She paused. I understood it before you did. He nodded, did not object, because it was true. Surveillance arrived, as surveillance always does in such stories, gradually. She got used to it in about 2 years, maybe less. People who have never lived under observation think it is impossible to live with, but you grow accustomed to it as to chronic noise, the way one grows accustomed to a radiator that clicks at night. The first sign was an ordinary evening. Yuri was on a trip. The children were asleep. She stood on a chair dusting an old, heavy chandelier. The cloth caught on something under the base of the shade. A small object, neat, like a button, with a thin wire running into the electrical cable. Skillful. Without special knowledge, she would never have found it. She stood on the chair and looked at it for about a minute. Then quietly she stepped down, put the chair away, folded the cloth, went to the kitchen, poured water. She did not touch it. She did not call the neighbors. She did not write to her husband. She drank the water and thought, so that is how it is. So now it is like this. From that evening, she spoke differently at home. She did not fall silent because that would have been too obvious, too much like knowing something. She simply chose her words, the way one chooses where to put a foot on a slippery road. The phone rang every Wednesday at about 11 in the morning when Yuri was not home. A male voice, polite, no name. Valentina Ivanovna, how are you feeling? Fine, thank you. Are the children healthy? Yes, everything is fine. Splendid. If you need anything, call. No numbers for calling were ever given. It was a one-way conversation. First, she tried to determine who it was, by voice, by pauses. Then she understood that it was pointless. The voice could be different. The calls were always the same. It was not a person. It was a system reminding itself of itself, the way scheduled maintenance reminds a building that it is being watched. Yuri knew about the calls. When she told him, not at home but on a walk with the children, he was not surprised. I know, I have them too. And you were silent. I thought you didn't. People appeared at the mailbox, not always the same faces. The system was cleverer than placing one face at a permanent post. An elderly man with a newspaper, a young man always on the phone, a woman waiting for someone at the entrance. That someone never came. She began noticing them after about a month, then realized she had been noticing longer but had not named what she saw. The worst part was the kindergarten. She brought Lena and looked around and saw someone familiar. Familiar not personally, but by type. The way they stood, the way they looked slightly past, never straight, the way they disappeared when she held her gaze. Once she approached one, a young man in a gray coat with a folder under his arm. Are you waiting for someone? No. Then why are you here every day? He looked at her, not embarrassed. I live nearby. And he left. She never approached them again. She understood it changed nothing. The system does not embarrass. The system just keeps working. She began keeping diaries before the chandelier, before she had words for what the chandelier meant. Day, weather, what Lena had said at dinner, where Yuri was. The small notations of a woman whose life had become too irregular to trust to memory alone. After the evening on the chair, when she stood looking at the small, neat object at the base of the shade, she reread each page and saw, between the lines, what she had not noticed while writing. Dates that coincided with trips, conversations that might be quoted, details that in the wrong hands could become anything. So she made a second place for the things she needed to remember. She sewed a hidden pocket into the bottom drawer of a large chest of drawers. Outside, ordinary fabric. Inside, a narrow pocket holding a thin notebook. The most important things moved there. New entries were short, encoded the way people without special training encode, through images and everyday details, things only she would understand. The chandelier creaks again, meant the curator had called. Galia looked out the window a long time today, meant an unfamiliar man had stood at the entrance longer than usual. Letters, the real ones Yuri sometimes sent from trips, she hid in the ventilation shaft of the bathroom, in a small gap between the grill and the wall. Wrapped in oilcloth against the damp, pushed as deep as her hand could reach. Later, in the single book she would eventually allow to be published, she would write, without details, in one sentence, that in those years she learned why people hide dear things in the walls of houses. Not from greed, from love. The inspection came in February of a year her memory mercifully blurred, leaving only the feeling. Cold, dark, Yuri on a business trip. 4 men. 1 in a fire inspector's uniform, 3 in civilian clothes. Their documents looked real, or were real, there was no way to tell, and by then she understood that the difference did not matter. Scheduled fire safety inspection, they said. They walked through the apartment for over an hour. They opened cupboards carefully, professionally, dropping nothing. They looked under beds. They went into the bathroom. Valentina stood in the hallway holding Galia, who had woken from the noise, watching strangers with huge dark eyes. The chest with the double bottom they approached last. They opened it. They inspected the top shelves, the middle. They pulled the bottom drawer, looked in. A pause. Another pause. Valentina did not flinch, did not change her breathing, held her daughter and looked at the wall straight ahead. The drawer was pushed back. At the door, the man in the fire inspector's uniform turned. He spoke quietly, without threat, and what was in his voice was worse than any threat. Valentina Ivanovna, you are a smart woman. Smart women are silent and live to retirement. You do want to live to retirement, don't you? She looked at him. "Good night," she said. The door closed. Galya quietly snored on her arms, falling asleep again. Yuri came home less and less. It was not his fault, and it was not hers. It was a property of the life they had fallen into, the way the orbit of a planet is a property of the star it has been captured by. He existed in continuous motion. Meetings, flights, banquets, delegations, handshakes. The country used him the way expensive tools are used, constantly, intensively, without rest, because a tool does not tire, a tool just works. But Yuri tired. Valentina saw it at each return. Something was leaving his eyes. His shoulders were heavier. He sat at the kitchen table, unable to start speaking, not because there was nothing to say, but because words required a strength he no longer had. Once he came back with a bruise under his eye. He explained briefly that he had fallen during training. She did not ask. She looked at his hands. They were whole. When people fall, hands go forward instinctively. His were whole. Another time he came from the dacha with a bandaged wrist. He said he had slipped and fallen out of a first-floor window. Nothing serious, just a bruise. He told it lightly, almost laughing. Too lightly. Too much laughing. She thought it clearly for the first time, as if someone had said it aloud in a quiet room. He had become inconvenient. A living hero who knew too much, who had seen too much, who had begun asking questions instead of smiling beautifully. He was no longer a shop window. He had become a risk. The system does not like risks. Systems know how to work with them. She did not say this aloud. Even at home, even in the rare hours when they were alone, she simply looked at her husband and memorized him as he was in that exact moment. Alive, real, hers. Because deep inside, where she did not allow herself to look too often, she already knew that these moments must be guarded. They would not last forever. Nothing too valuable to the system lasts forever. The last month before March 27, 1968, Yuri was silent in a different way. Not the fatigue silence, the other one, the one that lives closer to fear. He came home at 3 a.m. Valentina did not sleep. She had long since stopped sleeping soundly on nights he was away. She heard the key, the footsteps in the hallway, heavy, not his usual ones. Yuri always walked lightly, almost silently, guarding others' sleep. That night he walked as if carrying something invisible. He did not turn on the kitchen light. He sat in the dark. She entered behind him and stopped in the doorway. "Yura, I'm not sleeping," he said. "Go to sleep, Val. It's 3 a.m. "I know." She sat across from him. Between them, the table, the dark, and something else heavy, almost tangible, like the air before a thunderstorm. He was silent a long time. Then he stood and took a pencil and a sheet of paper from the table. She did not know where they had come from. Perhaps he had left them there earlier, deliberately, the way one leaves a tool where one will need it. He began to write, quickly, barely looking. She did not try to read. She watched his hand. When he finished, he raised the sheet, read it himself, paused, and tore it. Carefully, into small pieces. He folded them into the ashtray. She did not smoke. He had quit long ago. The ashtray stood on the kitchen table simply so, the way many objects stand in homes without meaning. "What did you write?" she asked quietly. "Nothing important," he answered. But the voice was different. She knew that voice. It appeared when he said the opposite of what he thought. Rare, but she recognized it without error. Yura. He raised his eyes. In the dark, his face was almost invisible, but she saw his eyes. "Valia," he said slowly, "if I'm gone, be silent. Just be silent. Don't look, don't ask, don't dig. Be silent and live for the girls." The silence covered the kitchen so densely that one could hear the snow outside, almost inaudibly, but still. "What are you talking about?" she asked, although she knew. "About nothing," he said and stood. "Go to sleep." She did not go. She sat in the kitchen until dawn. She looked at the ashtray with its scraps of paper and thought that some words, written and destroyed, still remain in the air, in memory, in the space between people that has no name but exists precisely. Another conversation, about 2 weeks later, on a daytime walk. He took her hand, which was rare in recent years, because public life had taught restraint even at home. "I'm returning to the flight program," he said. "I know," she said. She had been officially informed through the same man in the gray jacket, who had changed several jackets over the years but always remained the same. "I want to fly, Val. I can't not fly. It's the only place where I still belong to myself." She squeezed his hand. "I know," she repeated. "But something's wrong there," he said quietly. "With the aircraft, with the program. I feel something is wrong. I'm telling the leadership. They smile and nod." "You know what it means when they smile and nod? It means they don't listen. It means they've already decided." She stopped and looked at him. "Yura, maybe," he interrupted her, softly but firmly. "Don't ask. If I stop flying, I'm already gone. Understand? Not physically, just gone. I've been living for several years as if I am a stage prop. Only up there am I real." She did not ask because she understood he was right, and because she knew that a request here would change nothing. The decision had been made by neither of them. March 27th, 1968. The morning was ordinary. That was the strangest thing afterward. No signs, no omens. Just a morning, gray, cool, smelling of spring that was only hinting at itself. Yuri rose early. She heard him wash, clatter in the kitchen, put on the kettle, open the fridge. She came out in a robe, hair unbrushed. He turned and smiled. Not the official smile from photographs. His, home, a little sleepy. "Did I wake you?" "No, I did it myself." He poured her tea. They sat at the table, as they had sat hundreds of times before, as it seemed they would sit thousands more. They talked about ordinary things: Lena's school, fixing the bathroom tap, getting out of town in spring. The girls woke. Lena, loudly, with questions and the desire to immediately tell everyone something important. Galia came out quietly and silently leaned against her father. He hugged her with one arm, without interrupting the conversation with Lena. Then he stood, put on his uniform, took his bag. He kissed Lena on the top of her head and whispered something. She laughed. Valentina did not hear what. He lifted Galia, held her several seconds longer than usual, put her on the floor, came to Valentina. She was standing at the window, for some reason exactly at the window. She would think about that many times later. He took her face in his palms, a gesture that was only theirs, domestic, never done in public, and looked the way one looks when wanting to remember. "Everything's fine," he said. Those words again, too fast again. "Yura," she began. "Everything's fine, Val," he repeated, and kissed her, long, really, not as goodbye, because she did not allow herself to think, as goodbye. The door closed softly, as always. The news came in the afternoon. First, silence on the phone. Then, the duty officer's voice, dry, practiced, the words correct, official, calibrated to convey maximum information and minimum meaning. Catastrophe. MiG-15, Kirzak district. Circumstances being clarified. Valentina listened. She put the receiver down. She stood by the phone, a second, maybe more. Then she called the neighbor and asked her to stay with the children. Her voice was even. People later said, "Amazing composure, an iron woman." It was not composure. It was shock of such depth that the bottom had not yet been reached. The official version appeared quickly, too quickly for a catastrophe whose circumstances, by the words of those same officials, were being clarified. MiG-15, training flight, sharp maneuver, loss of control, collision with the ground. Pilot and second pilot Saragan killed. Bodies found at the crash site. Valentina listened and thought of one thing. Yuri Gagarin, at 27, had mastered a jet aircraft in conditions most pilots would see in nightmares. He had passed selection from thousands of pilots, the best, the most experienced. He had flown in space, where the price of error is not a catastrophe, but the end of everything. And he was gone because of loss of control in a routine training flight over a plane. Too experienced a pilot for such a death, too obvious a place, too fast an official version. She did not say it aloud. She remembered the kitchen, the night, the pencil, the torn sheet. Be silent. But she thought constantly. The coffin was sealed, explained by the nature of the catastrophe, technical details she had not asked to be explained. The fact was simple and terrible. She did not see him. The last time she saw him was in the morning at the window, when he held her face in his palms. That was the last. At the funeral, the whole world, it seemed. Cameras, delegations, speeches, flowers. The country said goodbye to its hero the way it knows how to say goodbye only when the hero can no longer say anything extra. Loud, solemn, on a state scale. Valentina stood at the coffin in a dark dress and looked straight ahead. The daughters beside her. Lena held on. Galia cried quietly. An official approached Valentina, bent down, said quietly, "Hold on, Valentina Ivanovna. He is now part of the motherland, part of history. That is more than just a life." She looked at him. "He was my husband," she said. The man stepped back a pace. Something in her voice, quiet even, without a single crack, stopped him better than any shout. The night after the funeral, the daughters asleep, the apartment emptied of people, she went to the kitchen where they had sat at night, where he had torn the sheet of paper. The ashtray was in place. The scraps of paper were gone. She had cleaned them away herself, long ago during tidying, without thinking. The words had disappeared twice. First he destroyed them, then she, by accident, finished the job. She sat in the kitchen until dawn, the second time in her life in the same place, with the same feeling. Outside the window. Snow, April, wet. Briefly, by morning it would melt. She looked at it and thought that some things cannot be destroyed completely. Not by fire, not by time, not by official versions. They remain in memory, in diaries with a double bottom, in letters behind the ventilation grill, in words said in the kitchen at 3 a.m. "Be silent," he had said. She was silent, for now. But silence is not forgetting, and she knew the difference. There are, the textbooks on grief will tell you, 2 kinds. The first is loud, open, visible. It has tears at funerals, a black dress, lowered shoulders, a way of walking that invites pity from strangers. The second is quiet. It lives inside. It asks for nothing. It is simply there, the way a wall is there. Every morning you wake and for a second you do not remember, and then you do. Every evening you sit in a silence where someone else's voice, someone else's footsteps, someone else's breathing used to be, and which is now, once and forever, the dearest sound in the world that will not come again. Valentina lived the second kind, and inside the silence lived something else, something she did not name for a long time, because naming it would have made it actionable. Anger. Cold, tempered, like good steel. Anger at the lie they had offered her as truth. Anger at the smiles behind which answers were hidden. Anger at the system that had taken her husband, that had first turned him into a symbol, then into an inconvenience, and finally into a legend more convenient kept dead. The anger kept her from breaking. It also kept her from being silent forever. 3 days after the funeral, they came again. Not the same ones. New faces, same breed. 2 in civilian clothes, 1 with a briefcase. Polite, restrained, with condolences at the start, neat as a shop-bought card. "Valentina Ivanovna, we understand how hard this is for you, so we will try to be brief." They took documents. They did not ask. They took. Technically, a temporary seizure for the needs of the investigation. Folders of papers Yuri kept in his desk, 3 notebooks in leather covers, an envelope lying in a desk drawer under a stack of technical magazines, thick, sealed, in his handwriting, to be opened in case of necessity. She watched the envelope disappear into the briefcase. "Will this be returned?" she asked. "Of course, after the investigation is completed." The investigation was never completed. The envelope was not returned. A week later she was summoned, not by letter, not by official summons. A man called, named an address and a time, a building with no sign, just a gray facade in a lane, a door with no identification. Inside, a long corridor, an office, 2 behind a desk. The conversation was short, almost friendly in tone. "Valentina Ivanovna, you understand that the death of your husband is a tragedy of state scale. The investigation is being conducted at the highest level. Any speculation, any careless words can harm the memory of Yuri Alexeyevich, you personally, and the children." "I have not said anything," she answered. "We know and appreciate this. We simply wanted to be sure the understanding is there." "The understanding is there," she said evenly. She stood up first, said goodbye, went out, walked to the corner, stopped, stood a minute, just breathing. Above the lane, gray sky, smell of rotting leaves and spring cold. Then she went home, to the girls. People around her began to disappear, gradually. Not all at once, that would have been too obvious. The system worked subtly. First, an engineer whose wife Valentina was friends with stopped answering calls. The woman explained at a meeting that they were moving. Her husband had received an appointment in another city. The farewell was strange, quick, avoiding eyes. There was a hug at the entrance and a guilt in the embrace the woman could not hide or explain. Then a historian, elderly, kind, who had visited them several times even during Yuri's life, who had talked for hours and recorded memories in a thick notebook, this man suddenly fell seriously ill. When he recovered, he was different, cautious, taciturn. He stopped calling. Then another, then another. Valentina did not count. It would have been unbearable to count people as losses in a register. She simply noticed and understood the pattern. Those close to her and to Yuri, people who could know or hear something, drew away. Not from malice, from fear, from the self-preservation instinct that Soviet decades had honed to absolute precision. She did not blame them. She herself knew that fear. The 1980s brought a strange sensation, as if something in the air was changing, slowly, almost imperceptibly, like a pressure shift before weather. People spoke a little louder. Questions once asked only in kitchens and whispers began to be heard in public, still cautious, but... Then an acquaintance, not close, from the periphery of that former life, came to her. He had a contact with a man handling archives. One could try, unofficially, through the right hands, to request investigation materials. She agreed. It was the first active attempt in all those years, the first step forward, not just holding the defense. 2 weeks later, the acquaintance called. His voice was different, compressed. Nothing came of it, Valentina Ivanovna. What does that mean? The man was warned. The materials he did not find. He says the folders were not in place. Pause. He himself is scared, asks not to be contacted again. And the acquaintance himself, after another pause, I also ask you not to call again. I'm sorry. The line clicked. She put the receiver down and stared at the phone. Then she did what she always did in such moments. She went to the kitchen, put on the kettle, sat and waited for it to boil. A simple action, concrete, doable when everything else was impossible. At the end of the 1980s, when glasnost had stopped being just a word, she wrote an official request to the Ministry of Defense. I ask you to provide the materials of the investigation of the catastrophe of March 27, 1968. Signed, sent. The reply came 2 months later. Official form, seal, signature. 2 sentences. The materials of the investigation of the catastrophe of March 27, 1968 are classified in the established manner. The declassification period is 50 years from the date the documents were drawn up. 50 years. She took a pencil and calculated mentally. 1968 plus 50 equals 2018. She would then be past 50. She looked at the figure and thought calmly, without bitterness, simply as a fact. They were counting on her not being alive, or on her forgetting, or on the world changing so that no one would care. They were wrong about several things at once. The historian reappeared in 1992, aged, with a cane, but with the same lively eyes she remembered. He came without warning, rang the doorbell, stood on the threshold with the look of a man who had been gathering his courage for a long time. Valentina Ivanovna, I'm writing a book, a real one. Is it possible now? It's possible, she agreed. Come in. They talked several evenings in a row. She told, not everything, not at once, measuring words with the caution that over a decade had become habit. He wrote, did not rush, did not press, was patient as a man who understood what she carried was heavy and that abrupt movements were out of place. The book came out 2 years later, thick, serious, with documents and photographs about Gagarin, his life, his flight, his death. About Valentina, 1 paragraph out of 300 pages. But in that paragraph, the historian wrote what she had not asked him to write directly, what she had spoken of carefully, between the lines. According to the recollections of Valentina Ivanovna Gagarina, in the last months of his life, Yuri Alexeyevich repeatedly expressed a feeling of outside control over his life and professional activity. According to her, he spoke of a premonition of a short life calmly, as of a fact he had already accepted. 1 paragraph, but it was printed in a run of 20,000 copies, 20,000 small cracks in the wall of silence. She held the book in her hands a long time, then put it on the shelf beside the ones she had kept all those years. Not because she was disappointed by one paragraph, because she knew this was the beginning. Neither the end nor the victory, just the beginning. The 1990s were strange. Everything old had collapsed and the new had not yet stood up. People talked about everything at once, shouted through breakdowns, exposed, opened, published. In that chaos of truth and lies, of real documents and invented sensations, it was easy to get lost. Journalists came to her, some with burning eyes and recorders, ready to write anything as long as it sounded sensational. Others quiet, thorough, with specific questions and notebooks covered in small handwriting. The first she sent away quickly. With the second she spoke cautiously, choosing each word as carefully as she had chosen them under the chandelier with the listening device 30 years earlier. Habits built under pressure do not disappear when the pressure is removed. They remain like muscle memory, like the ability not to blink under a direct gaze. One young man, a history student, came with a small recorder and a great many questions. He asked directly, "Valentina Ivanovna, do you believe in the official version of your husband's death?" She paused, looked at him, young, open, not yet knowing how expensive some words are. "I believe what I know myself," she said finally, "and I know more than is written in the official papers, and less than I would like to know." He wrote it down verbatim. She saw his hand move. "And what next?" he asked. "Wait," she said. "The truth does not disappear. It simply waits for its time, as I do." The daughters grew up. Lena became a doctor, as her mother had once been. Galia became an architect. Both knew exactly as much as Valentina considered possible to tell them. Enough to understand, not enough for it to become their burden. She had shielded them from that burden all her life, as she had shielded them from drafts in childhood, closing the window until they slept. But the grandson Yuri, named after his grandfather, grew up differently, with questions that would not let go, with grandfather's eyes and grandfather's stubbornness. He came to her and asked what others did not dare to ask. She looked at him and saw something she had long stopped looking for, a person to whom one could entrust continuation. One day she took the notebook with the double bottom from the chest and put it before him on the table. "Read it," she said, "but not now, when the time comes." "How will I know the time has come?" she thought. "You will know. It's the kind of thing one feels." He nodded, put the notebook away, and she felt, for the first time in many years, something like relief. Not joy, not victory. Just the relief of a person who has carried something heavy a long time alone, and finally someone has appeared who is ready to carry it together. She knew then that silence was not eternal. Truth is like water underground. You can cover it, pour concrete over it, declare it non-existent. You can build a beautiful building with columns and plaques on top of it, but the water will still find a crack. It always finds a crack. Sometimes it takes decades. Valentina Ivanovna Gagarina lived to the moment when the cracks became visible to the naked eye, and then she stopped being silent. Not because she stopped being afraid. That kind of fear does not pass completely, ever. It just becomes smaller than you, not larger. But because she understood that silence had become more expensive than words. Those who had demanded it were leaving one by one, and she remained. And with each year, her voice weighed more. The year 2005 brought several things at once. As happens at turning points, when long simmering events coincide and create something new. First, documents. Not the ones she had waited for officially, those would come later. Others. From the dacha archive of a constructor who had died in the 1980s and bequeathed his papers to a nephew, who only now, sorting old boxes, understood what he held. Among technical calculations and working notes, several handwritten pages, hurried, mentioning the flight program of March 1968. Details technical, dry, but between the lines what made the nephew call a journalist and the journalist go to Valentina Ivanovna. She read the copies a long time, several times. Then she raised her eyes to the journalist, young, nervous, clearly not fully understanding what he held. "This is not all," she said. "Can you add to it?" "I can," she said. "But first tell me, do you understand this is not just a story? These are living people, living families, living fears." He nodded. She looked at him several seconds, evaluated, then stood, went to the chest. The notebook with the double bottom was already with her grandson, but she had something else. What she had not hidden in wood and fabric, kept in the most reliable place: memory. Years honed, verified, preserving every detail with the accuracy only people living under the threat of oblivion have. She spoke for 3 hours. The journalist wrote, almost without interrupting. The documentary came out in the autumn of that year, serious, without cheap effects or sensational headlines. Several minutes with Valentina Ivanovna. She sat by the window, spoke quietly, looked not into the camera but past it, as if talking not to viewers but to someone invisible, maybe to him. One phrase she said in the film, then quoted everywhere. He knew, and I knew. We simply did not allow ourselves to say it aloud, because words make things real, and we wanted it to turn out not to be true. The film was watched by millions. A few days after its release, a small fire broke out in her apartment. Paper caught fire on the desk in the study where she kept printed copies of documents, letters, drafts of interviews. Neighbors called firefighters quickly. The fire did not spread far. No one was hurt, but the papers burned. All paper copies, to the ground. The firefighters concluded in their report, careless handling of fire. She had not smoked for 50 years. She did not keep candles at home. There was no source of open flame in the study. She read the conclusion, neatly folded it, put it in a desk drawer, then called her grandson. Yura, are the files intact? All intact, grandmother. I made 3 copies. One with me, one with Andre, one in the cloud. Good, she said. Well done. She put the receiver down, and for the first time in several days, allowed herself to smile. Small, quiet smile, for herself. The system had taught her many things over those decades, but the world had changed, and truth now had what it had not had before. It could exist in thousands of places at once. It could not be seized into a briefcase, could not be burned in one apartment. The last years were different, not easy. Easy they could no longer be. Too much lived through, too much carried off by time, but different, open. She opened up to the world the way people open up when they have nothing left to lose, in the sense of fear, and still have what to say, in the sense of truth. People came to her from Moscow, from Petersburg, from small towns she had never heard named. Writers, students, journalists, just people. Those who had grown up with Gagarin's portrait in class and wanted to know what was behind the portrait. She received everyone, talked to each patiently, thoroughly, without hurry. Poured tea, took out photographs. One photograph she kept especially. Not the famous one in the spacesuit. Another. The two of them at the dacha, summer. He is laughing for real, head thrown back. She is looking at him with a smile no one ever saw in official photographs. Just 2 people, just the dacha, just summer. This is what he was like, she would say, showing the picture. Not the one on the stamps, this one. People would look at the photograph and be silent, because in it was something that does not fit into official versions and state narratives. A living person, with his own laughter, his own fear, his own love, his own truth. She died in the spring of 2017, in her Moscow apartment, in her sleep, with no struggle, the way a candle goes out when the wax has finally given all it has to give. Beside her, in the way that matters more than any document, was Galya, her younger daughter, who had stayed the night for no reason she could name, simply because she wanted to be near her mother. People do this in the last days of someone they love. They cannot explain why. They feel it. Such things happen. In the morning, Galya entered the room. Her mother lay calmly, hands folded over the blanket, the way Galya remembered from her own childhood, when her mother thought of something far away and let her face go quiet. There was no pain on that face. There was no fear. Only the expression Galya had seen 1,000 times, the listening look, as if Valentina Ivanovna had heard something none of the rest of them could hear and had decided, finally, to follow it. The news did not come the way news had come in 1968. It did not come through the crackle of a radio and the carefully measured voice of a state announcer. In 2017, it came through phones and screens, through thousands of small messages sent briefly and precisely, the way people write when they know the words will not be enough. Valentina Gagarina is gone. People who had never met her typed her name as if they had known her all their lives. People who had been children when she was already an old woman remembered her face from grainy television. People who had no idea what Star City was or what it meant to live inside a myth wrote simply, "Thank you." The next morning, on the wall of the building where she had spent her last years, a small wooden plaque appeared. It was homemade. The letters were burned into the wood by hand, the way rural craftsmen used to mark the beams of a house, or the way people used to mark a calendar on a wall when no calendar was given to them. No one knew who had made it. No one ever found out. It just appeared, as things appear that are needed. The authorities did not remove it, perhaps out of shame, perhaps because they understood, for once, that removing one piece of burned wood from one wall of one building would change nothing. Perhaps they felt, as institutions sometimes do, the faint, humiliating nudge of a moral arithmetic that no longer added up. In any case, the plaque stayed. It is still there in the memory of those who saw it. A small, stubborn fact that refused to be tidied away. A month after her death, her grandson Yuri, who had been named after his grandfather and who had inherited his grandfather's stubbornness along with his eyes, launched a website. It was simple: white background, black text, photographs. No excess decoration. Her records, the ones from the double-bottom notebook, digitized and deciphered. Her interviews, full versions, uncut by editors. Documents collected over the years. The dacha photograph, the one with the laughter. In the first 24 hours, the site received 120,000 visitors. Then something unexpected began. Old people started writing. Not journalists, not historians, just old people who had been silent all their lives and who suddenly decided, in the months after Valentina Ivanovna's death, that it was possible to speak. They wrote from small towns, from villages, from outskirts of cities whose names do not appear in guidebooks. They wrote what they had seen, heard, known, each their own piece, small on its own, but together they formed something larger, the way a single drop of water is nothing and 1,000 drops become a stain on a wall. A mechanic from the airfield wrote what he remembered about that day. A radio operator wrote about the signals he had received and had never been allowed to discuss. A nurse from the hospital where the bodies were brought wrote what she had seen, and although she did not finish her sentence, what she had written was enough. The silence that had held for decades began to crumble, not loudly, not all at once, the way old plaster crumbles. First a crack, then a piece, then faster. 3 months after her death, the Ministry of Defense published the declassified portion of the investigation materials. Officially, the framing was that of planned declassification in connection with the expiry of established terms. Unofficially, the pressure had become too great, and even the heaviest doors sometimes opened under sufficient weight. The documents were examined by historians, journalists, independent experts. Several things were found that the official version had been silent about for almost 50 years. First, the investigation materials mentioned a third party. Without decoding, without names, just a term someone had carefully entered into a technical report and just as carefully did not explain. What that third party meant, the investigators never recorded, but those pages were not in the declassified package. Second, the meteorological data on the day of the catastrophe, as recorded in the official report, diverged from the data of the Meteorological Service of the same district for the same day. A small discrepancy, but a discrepancy. Third, the witness list included 12 people. In the archive, statements of 8 were present. Statements of 4 were missing, without explanation, without notes on why. Each of these things was small. Each on its own could be explained away. But together they form precisely the picture Valentina Ivanovna had spoken of carefully, between the lines, all those years. Not accusations, questions. Not a verdict, doubt. But doubt substantiated, documented, expressed now not in the words of a widow, but in pages with state seals, in the language of people who had spent their careers learning how to weigh a single word. The grandson's site kept working. Valentina Ivanovna's records were read in schools, not officially per curriculum, but by choice, by teachers who understood that the true history of a country is not only the history of its victories. Students wrote diploma theses, documentary directors made films, historians cited her memoirs in serious academic editions, with footnotes, with sources, with the respect that is owed to someone who carried an entire archive in her memory because she could not afford to carry it on paper. Once, the grandson found, in the comments to the site, a short unsigned message with an email address that later turned out to be inactive. It said only, "Your grandmother was right. I know. I cannot say more. But she was right." He could not establish who had written it, but he saved the message as a separate file with date and time and added it to the archive, because he had understood what his grandmother had taught him with her whole life, that every word has weight, that every testimony has value, that every voice torn from silence is a small victory over what silence imposed. There is one photograph you may not have seen. It did not hang in Soviet schools. It was not printed on stamps. It was found in the grandson's archive among hundreds of others. Valentina Ivanovna Gagarina, alone, without her husband, without officials, without photographers, without an assignment, standing at the window, the very window at which she had stood on the morning of April 12, 1961, when the radio changed her life. The photograph was taken later, judging by the wrinkles and the white hair, already in the 2000s. She is looking at the street. On her face, not grief and not a smile. Something in between. Something that happens to people who have lost much but have not given up, who were silent when it was needed and spoke when the time came, who learned at great cost that patience and courage are not opposites but the same virtue, applied at different speeds. Under this photograph, the grandson wrote a caption, simple, exact. She knew everything. She remembered everything. She waited. The frame has come full circle. We began with the famous photograph of Yuri Gagarin in his silver spacesuit, framed by a school wall, with a woman almost out of frame on the left in a dark coat, hands folded. We end with a photograph of that same woman, alone, standing at the window of her own life, framed by no one. The first photograph belongs to a country. The second belongs to a grandson who understood, because she taught him, that memory is a form of justice. Valentina Ivanovna Gagarina, née Goryachova, daughter of Orenburg, Feldsher by training, wife of a cosmonaut, mother of 2 daughters who are still alive, widow for 52 years of a man who flew once around the earth and never flew again, keeper of a double-bottom notebook, keeper of letters behind a ventilation grill, keeper of an ashtray in which words were destroyed twice, keeper of a silence that lasted half a century and was broken not by a bombshell, but by a slow, patient, dignified accumulation of small acts of truth. She did not need to reveal anything sensational before she died to be worthy of attention. She needed only to have lived and to have chosen, day after day, how to live within a story that was never entirely hers. The plaque on the wall of her building is still there. The wood is beginning to weather. The letters, burned by hand, are still legible. In the country that has spent 100 years learning to remove things from walls, this is, in its small way, a kind of miracle. In another, larger way, it is the most ordinary thing in the world. A woman lived. She carried what she carried. She spoke when she could. She was silent when she had to. And the people who loved her, and the people who never met her, marked her absence with the simplest tools available, because they understood that the most ordinary tools, used with patience and without fuss, are the ones that last.